Welcome to Views from the Capitol, our budget edition, which is much earlier this year than it was last year, but still later than we wanted it. I am Jennifer Smith, Director of Government Relations for the Michigan Association of School Boards, and presenting with me today is Jason Helson from the Michigan School Business Officials. He's going to do your numbers. I'm going to do your weird language of politics as we go through the budget. We are recording this, so we'll have it out to share by the end of the week, and you can share that with anyone who wasn't able to be here. We ask you that you remain muted throughout the meeting so that we don't have that background noise. And if you have any questions, please put them into the chat and we will take them as we go. So first, it is July 7th, which is months earlier than last year, but still past the statutory deadline. If you've been paying any attention to what the statewide education organizations have been doing, we've been yelling about this since the beginning of June. June 30th came and went. They didn't even have session on June 30th. We finally got a budget at 3:15 in the morning on Friday the 5th, Friday the 3rd. And then it was passed. Finally, the whole budget was passed just before 9 o'clock that morning. They had started at 10 and 12 the day before. So we went almost 24 hours waiting for those final votes. They were the last votes they took. In between, there were a lot of policy bills that were part of this conversation, including the alternative certification for special ed teachers. That expires next year. We have now removed the sunset completely, so that language will remain in law rather than us having to go back every 3 years and extend it, which is what we've done for three times now. So that one was included. Mandatory letters training or literacy training was passed as well, and we'll talk about some of that in the budget. And Senate Bill 903, which is also tied to the budget, was passed as part of that deal as well. There were something like 60 or 70 other policy bills that they blew through between Thursday morning and Friday morning to get passed and sent to the governor as part of this budget deal. So that's part of the reason they went so long. A lot of the things they were passing had nothing to do with the budget. Things like renaming a highway and creating a new license plate, but they were all part of the deal. So they passed all of these policy bills, finally got to the budgets Friday morning, and then after 9 a.m., we're all able to go home and take a nap. So that's how we got where we are. As always, we should have had this weeks ago. And we have said over and over that once we get the numbers from the Consensus Revenue Estimating Conference, we had 3 proposals. We should have started talking then. We were asked repeatedly, what's 2 days? And we said it's 2 days past the law. And 2 days past when you have passed all of your budgets. And as long as school boards can follow the law, so should the legislature. We will continue to say that every time we're asked. But now we have one, we can look forward, and I'm going to turn it to Jason to talk about the numbers.
Well, great. Thank you, Jennifer. It's so great to be with you. I really appreciate the invite to come back. And yeah, I think we did take 1 and take 2 last year. So not to make light of the situation. I know it's stressful for you all, whether you're a school board member, superintendent, a business official. I know we've got plenty of our MSBO folks on the call as well today. You take that duty seriously, and that's clear from our perspective. So hopefully we can give you some of the highlights and maybe a few of the lowlights that are in this budget deal. We're still, of course, digesting it. Jen mentioned, Friday morning. Luckily, I was not down at the Capitol, but quick jumped online and tried to do a high level overview for our members, and we'll get into a little more in depth today. Of course, we're always focused on the high level things. Foundation allowance always comes first. So we heard throughout the spring $250 per pupil, and ultimately that's what we see. So the foundation allowance comes up to, of course, a new record high of 10,300, but it's about a 2.5% increase. And we see that carrying through through some other key provisions in the budget, which we've seen that pattern established in recent budgets with this legislature and this administration. And so, a lot of discussion and possibly some consternation of does that really cover your cost of doing business? I think what we'll see within this is there are some other pockets of money that could very well help with operations in some key areas, but it's not given to you at school district level in the form of the foundation allowance. And, that's where we get into that discussion about the local control. Um, some things that we see that are going to be closely tied to the foundation allowance. We see the implementation of a 3-year blended count, and this is essentially the better of our current year blend, which we're used to that 90-10 sort of blend and that fall student count being so important to our budget, or a 3-year blend if that's better. And so I see this as a step in the right direction. Hopefully, this can be sustained. Right now, it's set up as a one-time um, change. Um, but the exchange for that is the loss of the Section 29 declining enrollment funding. And so I believe, most, if not all, districts are going to be better off in this situation. We've talked a lot about how declining enrollment is so pervasive around the state. About 70% of districts right now are in that mode. But there might be one of those specialized situations where that loss of declining enrollment Section 29 funding could hurt you for 1 year. But if we can get this 3-year blend sustained for the future, I see that as a positive. The weighted foundation FTE approach that we heard so much about throughout the spring, we also see that coming into effect. And I see this as one of the big changes or big impacts of this budget cycle. So we see our section 41 for English language learners and our section 31A for at-risk and economically disadvantaged students rolled in essentially to section 22B. So some of the questions that have come up throughout the spring is, well, what about an out of formula district? And we've been assured by the state budget office that these are going to be treated as a separate payment stream, so districts won't lose out if they're in that mode. But along with that, some things that we might expect, hopefully some cutting of the red tape, if you will, and some of the restrictions and requirements of those grants to maybe better serve our students and make it easier on our staff to serve those students. Hopefully reduce reporting requirements. Jennifer mentioned Section 164M in the budget, as well as Senate Bill 903 are really going to be key to this. But also, along with that, we see another bump up in these funding streams, a 20% increase, which for at-risk, for economically disadvantaged students means 258 million more pumped into that revenue stream. So we've seen that significantly increased over the past 5 to 10 years. There's been multiple investments made in that, and hopefully some good that's happening within your districts as well. And hopefully this makes it easier to both spend those funds and spend them appropriately to support those students. For dual enrollment, we see an implementation of a new Section 21B. This was something we saw in all 3 budget proposals in the spring at varying degrees, but we see $40 million. It highlights districts in opportunity index band 4 or higher for reimbursement. But we'll see the implementation of a new program there. Educator compensation has been a hot button topic, especially for the Senate, as I understand it. We see Section 27L come back around with a price tag of $150 million. And again, that's a significant number when we talk about a $250 per student increase statewide being somewhere around 340 million with some rough calculations. When we talk about that 31A increase and the 27L $150 million price tag, that's what I'm talking about. There's some significant resources here that may be able to help, with operations and student services that aren't necessarily going to flow to the district through foundation allowance. But that 27L for educator compensation comes back $150 million. It's tagged as one-time funds. Last year, it came from a different source. This is through current year appropriations this year. And one significant change that was made was there's a language that says this is for bonus payments, not compensation for MIPSers. I think there was some consternation in the legislature last year when this rolled out. Districts said, okay, that's great. We can pay our teachers more. We know staffing shortages is an issue, and maybe this helps. But we can't necessarily take on the price tag of the taxes and the pension contributions. And so it was formatted in such a way where districts could net those against it and make those payments to employees and not take on those additional costs. This year, the Senate, the legislature has said these are bonuses. There should not be MIPSers pension costs along with that. And so we'll see how that plays out and whether the Office of Retirement Services weighs in there.
Before you move on, Jason, there's a couple questions about 27L. Subsection 2 and 4, are they back? And it appears they are not, but I will leave that to you.
Don't believe so. And so the compensation more closely aligns with what we saw with 27L2 last year. But again, this is different language rolled out in a different manner. 27L4, again, that was a supplemental appropriation last year that was intended to offset those increased health normal costs in the pension section of your budget. And we'll get to the MIPSers breakdown a little later, but spoiler alert, those health normal costs have come down so that revenue that was supposed to offset those increased costs, the increased costs aren't there this year. And you're going to see that come back down to previous levels.
And
Hopefully
maybe
that
you
helps.
answered this, but is any of the 27L set aside for retirement?
I think the intent with this language is there doesn't need to be any sort of set aside for retirement because they're saying you cannot make this reportable for MIPSers compensation purposes. And so there should not be any costs. Again, that's where I think for us school business officials, understanding, the ins and outs of this, we probably need Office of Retirement Services who facilitates and operates the MIPSers pension program to weigh in and say, yes, we can live with this language, or no, there's an issue with this. Because really the directive to make it reportable came from ORS, not necessarily within the budget language last year, but this is different language that we see in this budget bill than last year.
And if I remember, educator was not defined in 27L last year, and it still is not this year, correct?
I don't know off the top of my head. We will find that out.
Yes, it is. Actually, I just found it. Educator
Okay.
is defined.
Okay.
Within the
So
law.
my MSBO friends are hammering us with a lot of detailed questions
Yeah.
on this. I don't know all the answers. DC contributions will still apply. I believe you, Sonia. FICA costs, yes, of course, this runs through payroll. What do we do with that? I don't know just yet. I think we need a little more time to digest, and again, need ORS to weigh in on that. But we will definitely take those questions back and try to follow up with a little more detail.
An educator is defined the same as it was last year. In
Great.
short, it's anyone that is covered under a collective bargaining agreement.
Yeah, and I think that's really been, correct me if I'm wrong, but really been the focus of the legislature was very much focused on the teacher in all of this. And we well know we've got hundreds of different roles within our districts, and some have really intimate, working relationships with students, and some, like our members, are working in the support services and the ancillary services, but they're still supporting very much what's going on in the classroom. And so I know some districts took, again, a very focused view of that last year and focused on their union groups and their teachers specifically, while others tried to incorporate as many as possible.
And I'm going to change the subject and go back to the 3-year blended count. And as it's
Yes.
written, it says the average of your 3 years. So you take the three of them, divide by 3, and there's your pupil count. So yeah, it's
Oh,
at 33.3% or just an average. The other question, 31AA, how do we go about estimating our 31AA at risk next year? And that's part of where this weighted formula comes in to give you a little more stability versus waiting to see how much money they put into at risk. It will now be the per pupil multiplied by your amount of at-risk kids with their formula. It gets a little complicated as you get into your opportunity bands and all of that, but you're not going to count your at-risk kid as one kid. It will be one, what's the lowest number here? Somewhere between 1.19 and 1.26. So you would take the $10,300 and multiply it by that amount for however many pupils you have. So it gives you that stability going forward that when you hear what the per pupil is, you don't have to wait around and see if they cut or increase at risk. It will totally be based off the per pupil, and it works the same for English language learners.
and again, we're, I don't want to dismiss any of these questions, but we're getting into some fine details as well on that. That's certainly MDE, Office of State Aid and School Finance is going to need to weigh in on, okay, how do we actually implement this? But we know that, again, with over 10,000 students per year, decline right now, and about 70% of districts in declining enrollment method, we can certainly anticipate this helps with some stability, some certainty in terms of planning, where you're not 90% weighted on what does that first Wednesday in October look like for our district. There's a question about HFA and their district impact analysis. Jason, I just got a quick view of that this morning for the first time. So I don't know, but we've got a good dialogue going with them on a couple key questions. And so if there's a specific piece of that you want us to focus on, we'd be happy to look at it. Is that for the weighted FTE that you're asking?
Jason, I got it. I'm just trying to back into that 3-year average membership. So are we
Okay.
talking, are we going to wait for the fall numbers and then do the 90-10 and then take 26, 27, 25, 26, 24, 25? Or I just
I
can't, I can't,
I I
I'm
believe
assuming they've
so.
got,
I think that's what
yeah.
Jen's
I just
stating.
assume that there's some sort of a projection for next year's blended
Okay.
student count for 26, 27. It'd be nice to know what number, if they could even, like I would say, if they could add a column to say, hey, this is what we project your student count to be, and then we can maybe look at it. I think
Okay.
everybody knows what their student or has a pretty good idea
Okay.
what their student count's going to be.
Sure.
So I'd hate to have a
Yep.
district look at this and say, oh, I'm going to walk away with 1,000,005, and then
Yep.
the number that the state used is 50 kids off what the district uses. And then
Sure.
someone's going to be held
Yep.
to the fire.
Yep. We'd be happy to look into that. I don't know with any certainty to tell you, but thank you for bringing that up.
And I would
Yeah.
say as a whole, trust your numbers.
Yes.
We've run into this before where HFA's numbers have been off what districts are saying they're going to get. So trust your numbers before you trust HFA.
And I think that's, again, a really good exercise to take that number and try to dissect it and make it make sense. Jamie, that's on our website. It's all, of course, also on the House Fiscal Agency website, but we have posted a lot of those things on the MSBO state school aid page as of this morning. So if you don't see it, please refresh. We do have a conference committee section. I hope the MASB folks don't mind me plugging the MSBO website there. Moving on to some of the other numbers, early childhood and GSRP specifically. I've kind of said through the spring, we could certainly make some critiques of some inconsistencies or some changes that have been made, and I think we see plenty of those, some of those challenges in this budget. But GSRP appears to be one where this administration has consistently increased and invested new dollars. We see a target foundation for GSRP of 11,736 per student, and we see a $74 million increase in what I would call the base GSRP through 32D, as well as several sub-grants where we see some dollars flowing in as well. Safety and mental health, certainly one that I expect we'll have a few questions on, but 31AA, we see this split into two buckets. We see 200 million for public schools for school safety and 100 million for public schools for mental health. And I specifically mention public schools because there are some non-public sources and appropriations there as well. A lot of talk, of course, about the waiver piece. What we see is a district must agree to the waiver for the safety piece, but not for the mental health piece. And correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that's a change from how it was approached in 25-26, where you had to agree to the waiver to accept any funds under Section 31AA at all.
That is a change. They also added into that a per pupil cap. So no matter how many districts apply for the money, you're not going to get more than $147.06 per pupil for school safety and $73.53 for mental health. And they divided the two to put the waiver language only on school safety. They did not change the waiver, but they did tighten the definition of mass casualty and made it clear that it is physical injuries and the incident must result in 2 or more fatalities. So it's a little tighter than it was before. We have been arguing about this language all year. Unfortunately, the school districts that sued lost in the courts, which empowered the governor to keep it in. So even getting the little bit of change we got was better than nothing, but it is certainly not what we wanted.
Christy, in response to your question, I believe, yes, you can parse those out and you could participate in the mental health piece without participating in the safety piece. Does that make sense, Jen, or does that match your understanding?
I think that will depend on MDE and how they set up the system. Right now, it is 31AA, yes or no.
Okay.
So it'll be up to MDE, and I don't know at this point what will happen there.
Well, one of the nice things is we're used to a new 31AA system every single year. I don't think we've had any consistency in that application or reporting process since its implementation.
Somebody asked to repeat the amounts. So for mental health, it is $73.53 per pupil. And for school safety, it is $147.06 per pupil. And that will be the amount that is allocated to each district that opts in. The deadline will go back to where it was. And with it moving so much last year, I don't remember. I believe it's mid-November. But all of that'll come back out from MDE.
Absolutely. Another headline that we've seen again and again, not just this spring, but over the past several years, is literacy. And of course, Section 35 is where a lot of those literacy grants live. We see multiple changes here. We see some reallocation of some of the traditional funds, but we do see I've got 35A4, but that doesn't sound right. I think it's 35A10. 35A10 for letters professional learning. And it goes on to define, the system of approved providers and letters LETRS, of course, is the one that's been debated a lot and referred to. I do see in that $75 million in total. I see quarterly reporting to MDE required through that as well. Couple other things under Section 35 that jumped out at me: 50 million under 35P as a competitive grant. And that is the prioritizing lower levels of literacy on the M-STEP for districts. And that's the tutoring piece. And I see Section 35Q, which is not necessarily a district concern, but it is an MDE required literacy dashboard that must be implemented. So again, a lot of focus, some agreement throughout the spring in the proposals, but that's where we landed. But we see some significant dollars invested under Section 35 for literacy. Section 51 with special ed, we see a couple, oddities, if we will. I don't know if that's a fair word, but that's what I'm going to use. We see some $100 placeholders in the federal funds piece, and we're not exactly sure if that's because we're not sure of what the appropriation is, or if there's some gamesmanship here. We anytime we see that $100 mark within the budget, we generally consider that a placeholder that's going to be filled in with an actual number later. But we also see kind of an overall decrease in the budget because of this that we don't necessarily expect to fully come to fruition. So there is some language elsewhere in the budget that says the state and MDE are going to exhaust every opportunity to take advantage of those funds as they become available. So I guess more to come on that special education federal funds line item. We also see Section 51I, which has intent language for a new special education reimbursement formula for fiscal year 28. It lays out some targeted weights for disability categories and student needs. And so we'll see, again, just intent language at this point. We'll see if that sticks around, but interesting to see that in black and white. Vocational ed, of course. Yeah,
Jason,
go
can I
ahead.
interrupt for a second?
Absolutely.
There's been a few questions back on 31A about the carryover funds, and I'm wondering if we know what happens with those, or is that something we need to wait for MDE to explain?
I definitely think we're going to need some MDE involvement there. But just off the top of my head, you've got that annual report that's due in summer 2026. I believe you would still have an eligible carryover period for your 25-26 grant dollars. And I don't think that's an unusual situation for districts to be in with those continued investments in 31A. I know I've heard from several districts that have struggled with some of the requirements and restrictions and some of the increased funds to try to spend those dollars, especially when we're talking about things like smaller class size that involves hiring more staff or more specialized staff. So my expectation, again, we will dig into this a little bit in terms of what exactly will happen, but my expectation is you'd have an eligible carryover period still in the 26-27 school year. Whether or not they would attempt to roll that in, I'm not sure that would be an eligible use of prior year grant funds. So I'd expect you'd probably have to carry that through June 30 of 2027 and report on that as you normally would. And then anything going forward from this piece would go through the weighted FTE approach. But I've been wrong before, so we'll find out more and see if we can share more as soon as we know more. Um, we'll still use our. No, I'm gonna continue on. Vocational ed, of course, lives in section 61 in the budget. I see again several increases in investments there, as well as an updated formula laid out for section 62 equalization. So if your ISD is one of those that receives that, we're going to want to take a close look at what that new formula or updated formula might mean in terms of impacts. MIPSers. MIPSers, of course, is our pension system. It stands for Michigan Public School Employee Retirement System. These dollars live in section 147 within the budget. And just running down this, since it is such a significant piece of the budget, both on the revenue and expenditure side. What I see is the rates introduced back in February stay in effect. I don't see changes made there, like what we saw kind of that last minute change over the last couple of years. Districts will or should see cost savings through lowered health normal costs. And again, these are for your folks that are in the more traditional plans. They're not going to have a PHF or a personal health fund. They're going to have a healthcare contribution through the subsidized health plan. So in a lot of cases, these might be your more experienced staff. But most other things are pretty much staying the same on the expense side. The state subsidized UAAL portion, we see a decrease from 15% of payroll to 13.5% of payroll. However, I would caution you that you're not going to see a bottom line savings for that piece of the rate change because that is the in and the out. We receive state aid dollars through section 147C, and those are paid back into the ORS MIPSR system on the expenditure side through payroll. So that will have a lower number on the overall district budget and the grant budgets at your district, but you won't have a bottom line impact like you will for that decreased health normal cost. What we see on the funding side, section 147A1, that was eliminated last year at the last minute, and that was kind of unexpected. That was one of those changes that happened at the 11th hour in the dark of night, and districts and ISDs lost with 147A1 and 147A3 about 112 million in state funding at the last minute. That appears that it's gone for good. It's stricken from this budget and it does not get reintroduced. Section 147A2 is your other big offset pot. We expected a small decrease based on the 3 budget proposals, but we see a slight increase at the last minute in this budget deal. These, of course, are offset dollars that help districts with MIPSR's expenditures, and they do boost your bottom line. Section 147C, I mentioned, is the revenue side of the state subsidized UAAL portion, which is the unfunded actuarial liability. That decreases slightly to match that 13.5% contribution rate. So again, business officials, as you're updating your budgets for your superintendents and your board, make sure you're balancing those out and not experiencing a net benefit in that whole program. And then remember that the changes in the law that were made last year to that longstanding capped employer UAL rate brings in that 15.21% permanently, down 5.75% from that traditional cap of 20.96 that was in place for years and years. That does not equate to savings in your fiscal year 26-27 budget, but it did impact your fiscal year 25-26 budget, as well as your baseline that carries forward. And so again, hopefully you're seeing a benefit there and some cost savings that are going to sustain moving forward. You know, my final kind of headline on the numbers side is higher education, which of course can be a touchy subject, but we see, you know, again, some changes made here. We see all of community colleges comes out of the school aid fund again. That's up about $4 million to about 497 million in this budget cycle. University spending, we see a significant increase, about $400 million additional pushed into the school aid fund. And so we had heard different proposals, different numbers. We had kind of heard rumors that that was going to be part of this budget deal and part of the deal in getting it done more quickly. Still not on time, of course, but not delaying it. And I think there was some debate about property tax cut and new revenue and all those sorts of things. And this was part of the political piece of getting the deal done. So when we add all that up, I get about 1.75 billion in higher ed and community college spending that's coming out of the school aid fund. And I'd equate that to about $1,260 per pupil. Now, of course, we've talked about this throughout the spring. We're heading in what I would consider the wrong direction with this. That number continues to increase, and certainly there is more that could be pushed into the school aid fund. But when we think about $10,300 versus about $11,600, what sort of difference that could make within your budget and within the investments that you can make in your district. So $1,260 per pupil, and we're at nearly 13 billion cumulatively siphoned out of school aid fund for non-K-12 spending since 2009. And so just pretty substantial numbers, dramatic numbers, and something to think about as you talk to your superintendent, your board, your local legislator, all of those folks.
So Jason, going back, there's a couple questions about the 3-year rolling average and hold harmless districts.
Mm-hmm.
And if that applies to them. So the question is, will MDE give clarification if the 3-year average should be used for the calculation of the hold harmless millage rate, assuming the 3-year average exceeds the current year blended count?
I think we're absolutely going to need MDE guidance on that. I'm not sure. I'm not sure that I know the budget language well enough to definitively answer it, to be completely honest. And I also think that, Office of State Aid and School Finance is going to have to weigh in on some of these issues and questions and changes in order to clarify exactly how that's going to work. So sorry, I can't offer a little bit more on that, Steve, but that's kind of my gut feel right now.
And then if they modify, sorry, different topic, special education. If they modify the special education reimbursement formula, there would need to be a hold harmless due to the Durant case. And I believe we have a maintenance of effort as well from the feds. So we can't really cut that if we redo the reimbursement, right?
I would agree with that, anything that where we look to change that, I think the state's going to have to be serious about that being an investment versus, a redistribution of dollars. I would agree with Brian's statement, and in theory, certainly we've dealt with hold harmless in the special ed finance world for many years. So that's not an unusual topic or an unusual term when we're talking about that. And I think they would have to be viewed through an investment lens due to the maintenance of effort issue. Absolutely.
While you're thinking of more questions for Jason, there's a few pieces that aren't number related that I wanted to talk about. Under school meals, it will continue. It will also require you to participate in the National Breakfast Lunch Program or Breakfast Food Program, as well as lunch. Right now, it's just lunch. And it also adds money to reimburse all non-publics that also participate in both of those programs. We saw the non-publics added last year at the last minute. We actually were fighting to get them taken back out. Obviously, we failed that fight, but it's a conversation that is ongoing. 164K last year was a weird section that penalized you for all sorts of things. The things that it penalized you for last year are gone. And instead, you have to ensure that your district is issuing the presidential fitness test, which is also a policy bill that's been going around and hasn't really gotten the traction, wasn't expected to get traction in the Senate. So now, under that, you would have to ensure that each school in your district is implementing the presidential physical fitness test. The other thing that it requires is that you follow the federal smart snacks standards when it comes to pop and candy. And if you're paying attention under the meals language coming out of the House, they said you could not make pop and candy available to a student at all. This is their compromise. It's out of the meals language into 164K to say that you have to follow federal law. And then 21F is your virtual learning section. And that puts back in some language that had been taken out of other sections and will allow a district to provide up to 6 days of virtual learning. 3 of those can be for designated testing days and 3 for school closures due to conditions out of your control. However, to use them as a snow day, you have to use up your other 6 days and your 3 waiver days before you can use these 3 days. But at least there's some flexibility back there. I know there's a lot of districts that use that virtual learning on testing days, so they can still count those days. Starting next school, you'll be able to do that again. How many things got slipped through or missed? That's a great question. I don't think we know. They were pretty open with the legislation that they were trying to pass, all those policy bills. We did get a copy of that list, so we were able to look through it. There's very little education related. One of the big things I was watching, and I'm real curious how this is going to play out, is a brownfield redevelopment bill that is slated to cost the state up to $2 billion when fully implemented. Where they're going to find $2 billion for the general fund, I've got to guess. But it's good. That's going to be tough. So we'll see how that plays out in the end. There are a lot of other things that we're probably still catching up on. But as far as education goes, we saw the policy bills, we knew the policy bills, and none of them were terrible. We'll see what happens the rest of the year because there's still things hanging out there for lame duck. And then the last piece is Senate Bill 903. So Section 164M in the budget says that if 903 does not pass, you follow 164M. If it passes, you follow 903. Really, this was so Senator Camilleri could get the PA on it, and it puts it into the code, not into the AID Act. But it basically states that if you are getting payments under 22B, which is your weighted formula payments, there are certain things you must do. Originally, this was written that you must do them with your 22B payment. We got that changed. So now it's just if you're receiving payments, you have to do these things as a district, not with those specific dollars. So it talks about having to provide the ELL development. It moves a lot of the Section 41 language into 903, talking about administering the test, implementing an MTSS system of support for those pupils, and then the reporting back to the department about how many pupils you were educating under that. It also will require you to report literacy-related results for the school district as a whole. And that would be from the M-STEPS, the grade 3, grade 7, and SAT. You would have to report that back. A lot of the reporting that is included in here is things that you already have to do. And then at risk, it talks about you have to educate an at-risk student. You have to communicate information to the parents about them. You have to make sure that you are giving them the supports that they need. So 903 is pretty vague. And we worked to get it that way so that there was some accountability that made the Republicans happy, but not so tight that you couldn't spend the money with more flexibility, which was the whole goal of the weighted formula, as well as the better stability in the funding. So I will put a link to 903 in the chat so you can take a look at it. But it really should be things districts are already doing. This just says, don't forget to do them. Yes, brownfields are out of control. Yeah, they can be used for so many things. And these are considered reformational brownfields that we did this time. It appears to be tied to the Renaissance Center project in Detroit. As you may or may not know, GM has pulled out of the RenCen, so it's sitting there as an empty building. I don't know if the hotel is still there, but the questions have been, what are we going to do with the RenCen? And it appears that this bill was expanded the law in order for the RenCen to qualify. And that's where all the money is going to go, or is going to be lost, is in all that tax capture. So, like I said, that's going to be an interesting one. I was surprised to see it on the list. But once things made that list, there was really nothing we could do about it because those were the negotiated pieces in order to get votes for the budget. So I think they have created themselves a great big hole to go with the holes we're going to see in revenues going forward. But yeah, there's nothing, the brownfield law it keeps getting expanded over our objections, and it does cause big problems for the school aid fund. If a district can't reasonably provide the minimum minutes per week due to staffing, do we lose the entire 22B allocation? I have not looked that closely. Jason, do you know?
I believe that that language in 903 was, again, set up to try to isolate that piece of it. So, okay, if our district can't provide or can't prove or, whatever the case may be, then we're talking about a portion of it. I know there was some discussion about a 22B6, I believe, payment. So it would be like a separate line item on your state aid status report. So in terms of, do we lose our entire 22B allocation from our foundation allowance? The intent, at least as I understand it, is no, absolutely not. That those pieces would be looked at separately, and that was also part of that discussion with an out of formula district, that payment, that stream could be looked at separately. And that's why they were not in danger of completely losing out with this change. Again, Michelle, I think they would look at the ELL piece separately from the economically disadvantaged piece. But again, we're going to need certainly more guidance and more detail from MDE because this is a pretty big shift. I think, the conversations that have happened through this spring, I think the school community in general was very positive and very encouraging on this piece. Again, hopefully providing more flexibility. But when we talk about, certainly 1.6 billion, in that fund, in that stream, those are certainly some significant resources that again needs to be worked out exactly how much scrutiny is going to be there. But I think providing a little bit and maybe a lot more flexibility is going to be a positive thing for districts. One question that comes to mind, Jen, is okay, so we've made this change. How do you see it? And sorry, I didn't give you a heads up on this, but how do you see it in terms of permanence? Could a future legislature say, no, we're going to put this back in 31A and we're going to re-implement the old report? Or do we see this as a more foundational shift that, they wouldn't necessarily look at it that way?
I think that this will be a more permanent fix. It was agreed to by all three chambers, and we were even told early on in the House, if it's not in our budget, it doesn't mean we don't agree. So it was one of the few things that we expected to see and did see when the budget came through. So I do think it will be a fairly permanent change. And in the cynical side, in a few years, there's going to be people here that don't even know what 31A
Sure.
used to be. So next year's budget, when they look at it, all the 31A language is going to be gone except for teen health centers and dental and eye screening. All the other language won't exist anymore because it's been deleted to put into 903. So that will also help maintain it. The goal, and unfortunately, with the governor doing this in her last term, the goal is to continue to add other pieces to this weighted formula, similar to what we saw in the School Finance Research Collaborative. Special ed is a big one, and I know there's intent language in the budget. That language is not totally agreed to by all of the special education world. And that's going to be a really hard one to do because not only do you have to figure out how you're going to weight the different types of disabilities, but you also have millages across the state that have uneven funding for districts. And in doing these weighted formulas, we don't want to harm any district. So you have to figure that out too. And it's the same with CTE because of their millages. It'll be the same thing that makes it a little bit harder to make sure no one gets harmed. But there is still talk among people that will still be around next year. But I think any expansion of it is going to depend on who our governor is and what the makeup of the House and Senate look like. But I wouldn't worry right now about the weighted formulas going away. This was so widely supported by the education community on all sides. It was management, it was labor, it was publics, it was PSAs. Like everybody was on board with this. So you finally found something everybody likes. And that's a incredible rarity, especially in education. So I do think they'll stay. I was also asked about why is there so much money in the university or of the universities in the school aid budget? And the simple answer is the general fund is struggling. Ever since the 2010 budget, when we made that $150 million loan to community colleges, they've made it very, very easy to continue to move more and more funding into school aid fund. They base it on the Constitution saying that it's for education. So community colleges, as you are well aware, are fully funded with school aid money. The universities are, I think we're at about half. Actually, this year, the school aid fund will pay just over half of the university budget at 1.25 billion, with 1.1 still in the general fund. But with an absolute refusal to look at revenue sources, this keeps happening because we are the revenue source to them. The school aid fund remains healthy, and so it is easier to move universities into the school aid fund than it is to talk about actually creating a larger pie for our general fund. And unfortunately, going forward, between the road funding package that went through, the economic picture that we're in, the brownfield bill they just passed, there's no end in sight for the fall off of the general fund. Hopefully, the economy will pick back up. But January's consensus revenue estimating conference is going to be really interesting. And that is $1 million question, Christy. Why are we required to pay for dual enrollment if community colleges are fully funded? I can't answer that. I can't answer that. The other form of that question I get a lot is community college is free. Why are we paying for it? And I can't answer that. It is a question we ask. It's not a question we get an answer to. Infrastructure grant in 12E.
Yeah, that went from 100 to 50. And I don't know if I have more details beyond that.
I think I do. Let me look. Yeah, so they are appropriating $50 million for grants for critical infrastructure needs, and the grants are capped at 10 million. but 8.8 million of that is designated to Flint Community Schools to demolish their buildings. The budget doesn't say Flint, but the description does. The description only meets Flint. Flint is the only school that meets the description. So 8.8 million of that is for them to demolish their buildings. And then the rest is there for competitive grants.
And my understanding is that was tied to participation in the 11Y infrastructure study. I think the overwhelming majority of districts participated, have a report, but the two are linked together. You know, a lot of discussion about the 3-year blend. The process for that is actually not redefined. They have simply added language that says that it applies to every district. And so that is, you know, on page, let's see, page 19 of the omnibus language, if you want to look at that. So you had a question about 32P. I'm aware that was reintroduced. I know that was a last minute cut last year. It didn't save a ton of money. It was extremely unpopular. I'm not sure I know, you know, a whole lot beyond that, but it is nice to see that, you know, re-implemented. I think that's a, you know, positive move. And we see 32T strong beginnings also along with that. Again, that's one of those investments that kind of go along with the GSRP. And we've seen several of those over the past several years.
32T will continue as last year. It was not included in this budget, but it was not repealed. So the language in that section of law will still be there in the 25-26 way it passed. How is the elimination of the 6% sales tax on gas and the new gas tax going to change funding? Well, this is actually a fun story. So they decided last year to repeal the 6% sales tax on gas so that every penny at the pump goes to the roads. In doing that, they included language that said the Treasury shall reimburse the school aid fund for every dollar lost under this elimination. As I'm sure you all feel, gas prices have gone through the roof. So that 6% sales tax on gas amount is way higher than they ever anticipated it would be. So now you're talking another hole in the general fund because they have to reimburse the school aid fund to the amount that they think they would have collected. So we will receive that money and the general fund's going to struggle. And when they put the new tax on gas, or when they upped the tax on gas, it is dedicated to the roads. So they can't pull the money out of that fund to then help pay for schools. The money has to come out of the GF. So do they have to, like, they have to pass their budget? Yes, they do. Treasury is required to do this, not the legislature. So, and Treasury is required to do that for a bunch of things. There's probably 4 or 5 pieces of the sales tax that have been eliminated that we've gotten that language put in to make sure that we're held harmless. That was the only way they were getting the roads package through, was to make sure we didn't lose $750 million on the gas tax. And instead, they're going to end up paying us much more because of where gas prices have gone. So again, it's going to be a problem when they won't talk about increasing the pie. With the amount of money in that roads package that they dedicated specifically in reserved funds, plus the money they have to give us, they're not leaving a lot of wiggle room in the rest of the general fund budget to run the rest of the state. At some point soon, we're going to hit a cliff and we're going to have to talk about revenues. It'd be nice if we could do it before we hit that point, but there are just people like the Speaker of the House that refuse to talk about any of it. Senate Bill 903 is tied to the school aid bill because it is mentioned within Section 164M. 164M requires you to follow what is in Senate Bill 903, which is new Senate Section 1280H. So the tie bar wasn't really necessary because of the way they wrote the language within the budget. So 164M says you have to follow new section 1280H. So they will both get signed. 903 will get signed after the budget gets signed. Are there any other questions that we could cover for you? All right. Well, as we mentioned, this is being recorded. We will have it available to all of you by the end of the week. MSBO has a page up on their website for all of this information. MASB's budget summary should be up by tomorrow. It takes a little while to get through everything in there. So we appreciate your patience, but both things will be available. And if you have any questions after this, you can always contact Jason or myself, and we will do our best to either answer or chase the answer down. But as always, keep in mind that some of these things MDE still has to figure out, and we may not have answers to. And that weighted formula, the 3-year count, those are going to be a big piece of what MDE's got to figure out over the summer. So the good news is the budget may have passed a little bit late, but it gives MDE time over the summer to actually implement these things before we hit the new fiscal year. So we're in better shape than last year, but not as good a shape as we should be. So thank you all for being here. Enjoy your summer. I hope you get time off as we hope we do. And we will see you next time.